Okay, recording has started. Welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall for August 8th. And we're going to be doing assumption problems in critical reasoning here. So, good time. There's no picture today. I don't usually take the time to root out a picture, but occasionally you're treated to one. But it's intermittent rewards, so to speak. No picture today. That is correct. All right. We've gone through the rules part already. We've seen that, and we've got to give the usual disclaimer. The problems in today's session are from GMAT Prep software. In fact, all of the problems in today's software are from the GMAT Prep, or in today's session are from the GMAT Prep software. So there are no except as indicated today. The copyright GMAT, the GMAT Prep software questions are free to distribute because the software is free. So make sure you understand that difference, because official guide questions we cannot touch on a study hall per these guys' explicit request. They're very nice about requesting it, so we'd be very nice about honoring it. But GMAT Prep, that's free, so we can use them. So that's where the problems are from. And don't forget that when you do a multiple choice question, you should pick the answer from that menu of answers and not in the chat box. All right, so let's do one. Let's go ahead and jump into it. How about that? Again, these are actually literal screenshots from the GMAT Prep software. If you ever, I made them about as big as I can make them, so there's no way I can magnify it anymore. If you have a hard time reading it, try to make your screen bigger if you have a hard time reading it. So, because that's about the only option you've really got there. But there it is. So give it a shot. I'll give you some time on a timer here. And good times for everybody. Remember where you get the answers to multiple choice questions. That is right there. Have fun. All right, so remember how this test works. If you don't have an answer, or if you have to guess, you got to pick something. In other words, don't not pick something. So I'll give you guys about 15 more seconds to make a guess. If you are Amit or Christina or Nada or Ritage or Sanal or Yanni, make sure that you pick an answer choice, because this test will make you pick an answer choice. Okay, so let's talk about it. There's still a couple of you. I'm looking at you if your name is Nada or Yanni. That means you still don't have an answer yet. Yanni, you just pick one. Okay. Again, remember that you have to guess on these. The other element of success here is guessing really quickly once you realize it's time to guess. Like if you are lost or confused or whatever happens, then you got to just own that and be like, hey, I guess I'm lost or confused or whatever, and just rip off a guess right then and there. So here's the answers to this problem. So we are sort of all over the place on this one. We have two answers that are more popular than others, but not by that much. So what we're going to do is table this problem for just a second and look at some simpler examples just to make sure that we know what we're talking about here. So, yeah. Okay. Let's make sure we know what an assumption even is in the first place. So let's talk about that. What actually is an assumption? So let's open this by means of an example. So let's say I tell you that Joe is a fan of the soccer club, Peñarol. Therefore, Joe is awesome. Okay. So what is an assumption here? The question is, I'm going to give you a couple of options, and we're going to make a decision there. Which of the following is an assumption here? I'll give you two options. Number one, if someone is a fan of the club thing at all, then he or she is awesome. Number two, if someone is a fan of a soccer club, then he or she is awesome. Or either of these. So I'm going to go ahead and erase the answers that you had to the multiple choice question. Since these are 1, 2, and 3, let's make them A, B, and C. So pick A if you think just the first one is an assumption. Pick B if you think just the second one is, and pick C if you think that either of those is an assumption up there. So what do you think? Okay, most of you have picked something. Again, pick something or other here. All right, so here's the group responses. There's still 1 or 2 of you who haven't picked, but we're not going to keep waiting here. So what you should have given me is this choice. It's just A. So for everyone who picks C, it means you kind of don't really know what an assumption is, or at least which one of these, I mean, at least how that applies to the problem at hand. But it's one of those things that you know for sure when you're out there in the real world talking about assuming things. But it's easy to forget when you're in this sort of academic environment. So, I mean, let's talk about it. Who can tell me what an assumption is? Actually, before we get to that, I mean, this might seem kind of dumb, but you might make this problem easier to think about by just changing assumption into a verb, like by just changing the word assumption into the word assume. So, like, which of the following do we have to assume? I mean, in other words, we didn't really change anything because we just said assume instead of assumption. But that alone might be enough reason to convince the people who chose C that that's not it. Who can tell me what assume means, or what assumption means? Like, what is an assumption? Because if you pick the hidden link between conclusion and premise, not really, because that's what would make you think the answer to this is C here, that both of these. Because, I mean, option B here is just as much a link between conclusion and premise as option A is. So this is what a lot of people are thinking, and this is not really what's going on here. In other words, an assumption is not just anything that links an argument to its conclusion. I mean, it's a much stronger thing than that to say that something is an assumption. And then this one, I'm not sure, Grace, I'm not sure exactly whether you mean this super literally or not, but be careful with the way that you're using based on here, because based on the argument would, again, if you're being super literal here, I don't know if you are, but if you're being very literal here, then based on would mean that it like comes from the argument. But this is actually backward. Again, if you're not being literal, then that's a different story. But this is backward, meaning that the argument is based on the assumption, or assumptions, not the other way around. So it depends on what you meant. If actually what you meant is that, like, if you hear the argument, then you know the speaker was assuming this, then yeah, that's true. But if you mean that this is a statement that is based on the logic of the argument, then no, it's not true. So, okay. Now let's move into some of the more accurate answers to this. So there are 3 answers that I like here. Let me grab those and put them on the screen. So before we do that, here's one more that's not accurate. Let's make sure we get that out of the way too. This one, I mean, this is sort of getting there, but there's this part here that is a big worry. And that's this word right there. I mean, to make something weaker, I mean, maybe that was just a typo, or you weren't really thinking when you wrote that, or whatever. But an assumption, it should be clear that an assumption is not something that defeats an argument. I mean, that would be kind of silly if that were true. So, Ahmed, that's true, but you're not really saying anything there because you're saying that an assumption is something that we assume. So, I mean, you're defining assume by saying assume. So maybe that's not false, but it's not really defining anything. So let's talk more about these other options here. Let me take this stuff over to the next page. Okay, there's the stuff from the previous page. Now, here are 3 versions that are more accurate. That one we'll actually look at last. This one and this one. Yeah, these are really good. So Mariella, the NL, you guys are on the train that we want to be on here. And then some of you guys are saying that, in other words, some of the more recent chat entries are saying sort of the same thing as these. But yeah, this is what matters here. It has to be true. It is absolutely necessary. So that is the key concept of what an assumption is. So an assumption is something that you absolutely need for the argument to work. In other words, it's the bare minimum. I mean, if you think about what the word need means, you'll come to the, if you think about enough examples, you'll come to the realization that the word need is always talking about like minimum. You know, if you say, what do you need to survive, then you're going to talk about like minimum amounts of things like food and water. You know, like if you need to eat at least like 300 calories a day to stay alive, then in a very technical sense, you need 300 calories a day, but you do not need 301 calories a day. So it's kind of the same thing here. Like, what is the absolute minimum floor level information that we need for this to work? So, I mean, I'm jumping from the idea that Joe is a fan of Penhallow to saying that Joe is awesome. So that I have to have some sort of connection between those 2 ideas. Like there has to be a link between this and this. On the other hand, and we can, I didn't mean to highlight the idea of Joe. There needs to be a link between being a fan of this team and being awesome. I mean, I personally agree, but we need to have a link there. So we don't need B. I mean, we certainly don't need the idea that anyone who is a fan of any team is awesome. In fact, I mean, if you think about anyone who would make this argument, they are almost certainly not assuming B, because they probably think that fans of the rival team are not awesome at all. So this is certainly not something that has to be true, and in all probability, the speaker probably thinks it is false. So be careful with that. So again, A is something that we clearly need. B is something that's not, we don't need this, and the speaker is almost certain to think that it's not true. Because you know how it is with sports fans, they don't like the other team. So, okay, are we all on board with this? So it's something that you need to be true. It is something that if it is not true, Now what about this? And yeah, a couple of you guys are giving me different versions of this down here. So I'll put one more. I'll put two more versions on the board that are the same as what NL is saying. If anyone's not on board with the need part, you can go ahead and type a question or whatever in the chat box. But let's talk about these ideas here real quick. So these are all basically the same idea. These three that we have here. Because this is actually, I mean, this is another way of defining what the word need actually means. You know, if you say, I need 300 calories a day to stay alive if I'm out in the wilderness, that means if I don't get 300 calories per day, then I will die, is what it means. Or like if you need to do all the papers to pass a class, that means if you don't do all the papers, then you will fail the class. So this is another way of defining what the word need means. So I mean, for this argument to work, because that's what we're basing the whole argument on. The question is, how do you know there's a need to? I mean, maybe you're thinking of this. I mean, you need this statement. I mean, you don't need to assume that there is like an importance attached to being a fan of a soccer team. I mean, it's not that kind of need. It's not like it is going to make the world go around sort of thing. Maybe that's what you thought I meant. But when we say we need the statement, we're saying this reasoning does not work without the statement. Like you have to have this fact to get from here to here. So I hope that helps. This is another way of defining what the word need means down here. If you don't have it, the conclusion is wrong. So yeah, if an assumption is false, then the argument dies. In other words, it is no longer valid reasoning. So, I mean, ordinarily, now what's cool about this second thing here, this purple thing, is that ordinarily this would just be a cute fact about assumptions. But because these are problems that are multiple choice, it's not just a cute fact. It's actually a thing that becomes a method. It becomes a thing that you can actually do with answer choices. So if you have answer choices that are supposed to be assumptions, then this actually becomes an actionable plan. So you can make the choices false, and you can see which choice destroys the argument. So, and I mean, this is actually, yeah, there's various names that people attach to it. Negation test is one of those names. But it's basically just the idea of imagine that this is not true or doesn't happen or blah, 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 and then see if the argument just absolutely dies. So, for example, if you make A false, I mean, Peñarol is also, well, okay, I see what you're doing there, but you can always assume that when things have the same name in a passage, that they are actually the same. So, like, they're not, because, like, one thing these guys don't ever, ever, ever do is write, like, haha, I tricked you kind of questions. Like, it never happens. There are no haha, tricky type of questions. There are questions where you have to pay attention to certain things, but it's not like that. It's not he, I got you with names kind of thing. So if there's a team called Peñarol mentioned in the passage, then all of the Peñarols in the passage will be the same team. So, even if the team has a really generic name like the Bulldogs, which is 10,000 different teams in America. But if it's the Bulldogs, it'll be the same Bulldogs throughout the whole passage. So, yeah. And yeah, we call soccer what other countries call football. So, right. Anyway, Yeah, I hope that answers that question. Okay, so let's do this to choice A up there. I mean, if you said, if you make A false, how do you make A false? Let's talk about that. Chat box? Let's go to a new screen here real quick. How do you make this statement false? So we'll get back to Pinduoduo in a second. How do you make the following statement false? It was hot every day last week. Okay, how do you make that false? Chat box. I mean, you can do it's not true that, sure, you can put that in front of anything, but that's not really a meaningful sentence if you do that. I mean, that would be sort of a garbage sentence. It would be true, but, you know, yeah, there was, I mean, same thing with not hot every day. That kind of means two different things. You know, because not hot every day could mean that it was every single day it was not hot, or it could mean there was like a day. So it means, yeah, it means exactly what Yanni is saying that it means, and what Amit is saying that it means. That's what it means. So that's the negation. At least one day last week was not hot. So one thing that I want you to notice is that if you try to do this with any sort of memorized rules, it will be like the hardest thing in the world. But if you just sort of think about it with everyday common sense, then it's really not that bad. So, like, same thing if you have a statement that, you know, everyone in this room is a man. I mean, if you just think about what it means for that to be false, it's definitely not everyone in this room is a woman. Or no one in this room is a man. Those are definitely not what it means for that to be false. If this is false, it just means that someone, at least one person, someone in here is a woman. Like at least one person. I mean, yeah, if you say Sarah, but that's not really what a negation is, because obviously not all cases where this is false will be someone named Sarah. So be careful of that. Like, when we say the negation, we specifically mean, like, if this statement is false, then what does that actually mean for that to be false? If this is false, it just means that there is a woman with any name at all somewhere in the room. So, yeah, someone in there is female. So now let's see if we can do this with a statement that has an if in it. If, let's see, if you eat potato chips, if someone eats potato chips, if a person eats potato chips, he or she will get fat. How do you negate that? There's a bunch of ways that you could word this. There's not going to be like one super canonical way to word this. But again, use your sort of everyday common sense to think about what it means if this is false. This attempt is too extreme, that what this person wrote. This is not really the negation, because this is much too extreme to be the negation. So, too much. I mean, if we go back up to this statement here, if we said something like it was cold every day last week, that's, you know, because I mean a day can be not hot without being cold. You know, it could just be mild or seasonable or, you know, all those things that are between hot and cold. So, in other words, in that first statement, cold is too strong, it's too extreme. So same thing with will become thin. I mean, if someone just maintains their weight, that would also be the opposite of that. So, but, okay. This attempt is also not what we want. Because this is not, I mean, this is not the opposite of that. I mean, remember, if you do this right, then exactly one of these two statements should be true. Exactly one of them. It's actually a good guideline for figuring out whether you have done this correctly or not. Like if you make the correct negation of a statement, then in any particular case, exactly one of the two statements, the original and its negation, should be true. Because I mean, that's what a negation is. Like if a statement is X and the negation is not X. So I mean, one of those has to be true, the other one's false. So I mean, this is not a valid negation because, I mean, this is actually basically logically unrelated to the statement we have up there. But this is not a negation because it's possible for both this and the other statement to be true. So, because I mean, let's say that let's say that humans were such that we always got fat no matter what. Then this would be true and that would also be true, which means that these are not negations of each other. So, Julie, that can't be a negation because you're actually saying the same thing that this says, except you're not saying it has to happen. You're just saying it might. But X might happen is definitely not the negation of X will happen. It's just a less strong statement of the same idea. Okay, now what we do want is may not get fat is actually a non-statement. And that's not really, you sort of. I mean, you want to be a little bit more, you want to make that statement in a way that's a little bit more sensible to the kind of person on the street. Although you have the right idea. But here are some good versions of this. Here are two that are more along the lines of what you should do. So you don't have to use the words that either of these two people used, but if you have this idea, then that's pretty much the idea. Because like if you think about what this statement entails, this statement is basically telling us that everybody who eats potato chips will get fat. So if you want to get it out of if-then form, it might make more sense if you do that. So, because you guys had a lot less trouble with that statement. So, if I say everyone in this room is a man, then the negation is pretty clearly that, like, a person in here is not a man. So, just do the same thing here. I mean, if you state that without the if, then it becomes something like everyone who eats potato chips will get fat. So if you do this, then it becomes the same problem as that one is. I mean, the negation of everybody in here is male is someone in here is not male, aka female. The negation of everyone who eats chips will get fat. Notice we don't care at all about people who don't eat chips. This is irrelevant because we're not making any statement about these people at all. So if we negate it, we're still not making any statement about these people. So just make sure you know that. If there's like a group of people or things that we're not talking about, then we're still not talking about them. You know. So children are smart. The negation of that is like not all children are smart. The negation has nothing to do with adults. Just make sure you're on board with that. may not. I guess that is not really that different. Now that I read it again, that might have just been me being dyslexic and putting words, imagining words in places where they weren't. So, my bad. Fun fact, I actually am dyslexic, quite dyslexic. So if anybody else watching these videos is, I could give you a little bit of advice on that. But okay. Yeah. So, yeah, David, there's a big difference between may and may not. You know, what if you understand that what Michael wrote there, then you're good. So, but if you put this in this form, then it becomes kind of like that. So if we do that in this problem, choice A is a lot like saying everyone or all fans of Pinnacle are awesome. So, which I personally think is true. But if we make that false, then we get there are fans of Pinnacle who are not awesome. That's not a very strong statement. There could even just be one of those. But even if we have that weak of a statement, it still destroys this argument, because then we can't get from here to here anymore. So if A is false, this reasoning is dead. It doesn't work at all. So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that Joe is not awesome, but it just means that we can't prove that he is with this particular reasoning anymore. So what you should get from this is in sort of compact form, so now we can address this problem here. When you think about assumptions, you should consider them into, like, there are two primary ways to consider what an assumption is. And I mean, make sure that you are totally on board with these things, because I mean, think about what the word assumes and what the word assume means in the real world, and you'll probably make more heads or tails of this. But the first is a statement that is necessary. It's a statement that is absolutely necessary for the argument to fly. Or you can think of it equivalently as, if it is false, then the argument becomes invalid. And there's a danger here. I mean, these both seem like individually, these are both very straightforward things. I mean, one of them is I need a statement that is necessary. The other one is if I make this false, it will destroy the argument. I mean, those are both pretty straightforward ideas. But what the danger is, and this is a much bigger danger when you are in a stressful environment like a test, the danger here is getting turned around. Because notice how opposite the things are that you are trying to do in these two things. Like here you are trying to find something that makes the argument work, or is necessary to make it work. Suddenly when you do this, you are suddenly trying to make the argument not work. Like it is in fact almost exactly the opposite line of thinking. So it's dangerous because, you know, it's very hard to keep your head on straight and that kind of thing. It's much harder than you might think. So you got to be very careful about that. Just be forewarned. It's kind of like when you have a strength and weakening problem. It's surprisingly easy to pick a statement that actually defeats the argument when you were trying to strengthen it. It sounds absurd that anybody would ever do that, but it's a very easy thing to do in a testing environment. So be careful here. So let's talk about this. So what you should do when you read these arguments is you should try to put them, you know, into like conversational language that, say, a 10 or 11-year-old would understand. Like that should be your primary goal here. At least in your head when you read any critical reasoning passage. You should, in your head, translate the passage out of this horrible academic language and into words that a decently with it 10 or 11-year-old, would understand. Because you won't, the thing with these passages that's neat is they're not ever going to be totally full of jargon that would just be inaccessible to a person of that age. I mean, there might be things that you wouldn't think about at that age, and you might, if the passage talks about a particular disease, you might just be like, okay, there's this disease, and then not really go into it. But at least, let's see if we can do that. So, okay, I mean, there are these boats in 1992. The boats started illegally fishing these lobsters. So, I mean, meaning that there's like a license you can get to fish lobsters, and they try to regulate it, but these like pirate boats, so in 92, basically scofflaws or pirates or whatever started poaching lobsters. Like, not within the law, like without a license or whatever. And then soon afterwards, the annual tonnage of lobster legally harvested in these. I mean, what does this mean, second statement? The statement that starts with soon after. Tell me what that means in words that like a 10-year-old would understand. Chat box. Next. I don't know what you mean by, not just the word soon after, the whole statement that starts with that. Yeah, the legal fishing boats didn't catch as much lobsters, right, in terms of like total pounds or whatever. So, yeah, so the amount of lobster right after that, the amount of lobster caught by the legal boats went down. If anybody out there is thinking about number versus amount, this is actually an amount, not a number, because it's tonnage and not number of lobsters. It's not how many lobsters, but it's like if you threw them on a scale, how much do they weigh? I mean, that's more of a sentence correction thing, but in case anybody was going there. Yeah, so fewer and fewer lobsters were harvested, or at least whatever, right? So now, to the point where 4 years later, despite what does that mean? Again, I'm 10 years old. That confuses me. What does that mean in a way that won't confuse Ron, who is like a big 10-year-old? Yeah, the pace of it, or, like the same number of people or boats or whatever. I mean, you should take the time to think of what statistics mean. Like the level of fishing activity is kind of this hand-waving random abstraction. But if you think about how you would define that, it's got to be something like how many boats are out there, or how many total like boat hours are spent, or something like that, right? So so 4 years later, but activity still, you want to get more specific than that. Like, so 4 years later, like there were the same number of boats legally fishing for the same amount of time, etc. Like, everything was the same as far as the logistics go. But they caught 9,000 tons less than they did. It says in 1992, but what is the real point of pre-1992 levels? Like, pre-1992 levels are before what? Before the pirates, exactly. And then this person says, so I think that this 9,000 tons, that amount must have been taken by the pirates. That amount right there. Okay. By the way, when it comes to this sort of passage, I mean, remember that in critical reasoning you should not, like normally you should not be taking notes, but if you get lost or confused, then notes help. So if you do take notes, they should be notes like these. You know, they should be in like language that a 10-year-old would understand. I mean, the worst possible thing that you could do here would be to write down like exactly the same kinds of words that are in the passage, because then that will just not help you at all. That'll just keep it in this weird, undecipherable garbage language. But if you get it into like conversation language, you know, I'm 11 years old, explain this to me, then it'll definitely help you understand. So, okay. So what is there no reduction? Yeah, that's true, but you know, I mean, if you could take that into account if you wanted to, but again, they're not going to be tricky with you here. So if you're thinking about stuff like that, don't think about stuff like that. Like this is not these are not nitpick kind of questions. So in other words, if I say like, you know, I've been, you know, trying to stay on a diet, blah, blah, blah. So even though I have not gained weight, you know, I still wear bigger clothing sizes now. I mean, even though I have not gained weight, it clearly implies that I still weigh the same. I mean, it's true that if you read that really nitpicky, really literally, then it could be I lost weight, but they're not going to write it like that if I did. So, yeah, do not try to be a lawyer. If you try to do that, you will do horrible on this test, because these problems just don't do it. Like, these problems don't nitpick, and they don't stick a wire in front of you and try to trick you. Like, they just don't do it. So it's all about reading for sort of the big picture here. Okay, anyway, back to the question at hand here. Yeah. So all that stuff you did with like the in law school with trying to find loopholes in the black letter of the law, yeah, don't do it. Okay. So let's talk about these. Does anybody see anything that's necessary here? The question is, I mean, let's talk about how do you find these. And we'll talk about answer choices here in a second. But the question is, where do you get those from? Where do you get things that are necessary? So one of them is, there's basically two ways that you can magic these out of thin air here. But how do you find these is the question. Because the point is they're statements that are not in the argument. So you might be wondering, like, how do I find these things? I mean, they're not actually there. So, well, there's basically two ways. The first is if the argument makes a big jump from one topic to another, like from one idea to another one, like with no justification for making that jump, then you have to assume a connection. So that's what we did here. Like, we suddenly jumped from Joe and the fan opinion, oh, dude, Joe is awesome. That's kind of a big jump. I mean, if you're a fan of this team, it's not that big of a jump. But we needed an assumption to get us from here to there. Point A, point B, whoa, how did you get there, kind of thing. So that's one way to do that. Although here there's not any gigantic jumps in the reasoning. I mean, there's not anything huge here. I mean, they go from, I mean, this time frame is correlated to when the pirates started coming, and the 9,000 tons is correlated to what's here. So they're not really making any big jumps. But the other way that you can find assumptions is if you can think of a legitimate objection to the argument, then you have to assume that the objection is not a thing. So I know not a thing is not exactly very formal language, but let me give you a simpler example than the argument we're looking at right now. Like, how about this? Normally, it takes 12 hours to drive to Portland from here being where I am. So if I leave now, I'll get to Portland at 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay. I mean, there are no gigantic jumps from point A to point B here. I mean, I took the 12 hours and I just added it to the time that it is right now, which is 5 p.m. and I got 5 a.m. So there's no giant jumps here. But what are some objections that you could make to this? Quite plausible objections. Yeah, like what if there's traffic? Okay. What if there's a traffic jam? Okay, what else? Okay, yeah, I think I've seen my previous sessions, the alien abduction thing, right? Like, what if the weather necessitates slower driving? What if I run out of gas? What if my car breaks down? Etc. I mean, even something like, what if aliens abduct me from the highway? Sure. Okay, and there are a bunch of those kinds of things. So the question is, what do I have to assume? I have to assume that all of these things are not things, like all of them. But what must I assume? So in the case of excess traffic, I have to assume that there will not be excess traffic. Or if there is, it won't slow me down. I have to assume the weather will not necessitate slower driving. What if I run out of gas? I won't. I have to assume that. What if my car breaks down? It won't. And what if aliens abduct me from the highway? They won't. Now, in terms of the GMAT would not give you an assumption like this one, even though, I mean, this red thing down here is just as much an assumption as all of these. I mean, you do have to assume this. But they will not test you on that because it's such a weird possibility, right? So you don't have to assume that there are no aliens. I mean, there could be all the aliens, but you just have to assume they will not abduct you. So remember, necessary. It's not necessary to believe that there are 0 aliens. They could be around every corner as long as they don't touch you. So you can do this too. And I mean, the cool thing about this is that this is a very normal thought process in the real world. Like, people are very good at objecting to things. Like, people are not bad at that. So can you think of any objections to this argument that's here? Objections? Yeah, because like when you see this, all right, I mean, they caught this much less stuff. So that must have been the fault of the pirates in that year. One possible objection that you could make here is, like, what if there were just not as many lobsters hanging out in the first place? Like, what if the actual population, that's an objection. This is a perfectly reasonable objection. Like, what And you might think of that as you read the argument. I mean, if you think of this as being a person talking to you, you'd be much more likely to think of that. Or what if they were abducted by aliens? So you also have to assume that the lobsters were not abducted by aliens. But again, they will not ask you about that sort of thing. So what if the actual population of lobsters decreased between 1992 and 1996? So you have to assume that it didn't for any reason, actually, not just because of pirates. I mean, you have to assume that the lobster population did not significantly decrease. If at all. So that's this. This is the answer that we want right there. I mean, this is one reason it might have, I mean, one of the reasons it may have decreased would be the pirate fishing. But the point is we have to assume that there is not a smaller pool of lobsters to choose from. You don't actually have to assume that. I mean, if this choice, Rafa, you don't have to assume that about pirates. No, you don't. Because you could have this answer choice say some other cause. I mean, this could also say, you know, global warming did not reduce the population of lobsters between 1992 and 1996. That's still just as much of an assumption. And if you want to know why, you can also do this. I mean, remember, this is your sort of nuclear option here, this number 2. Try making these things false and see if your answer choice is destroyed as a result. I mean, if you negate either of these two things, either the version of this answer choice that's here now or this, then the argument is destroyed. Like, if you negate the answer choice here, you get, you know, the illegal lobster harvesting was so extensive that the population actually declined sharply by 1996. If that's true, then this person's thoughts are probably wrong, and, you know, it definitely is not valid reasoning anymore, because it probably just means there's not as much lobster to catch. Same thing, even if it's global warming. If this is false, then global warming reduced the population of lobsters a lot. Let's say that it says significantly or sharply, like that one does. If that's true, then this reasoning is still not good anymore. Because if there were so many fewer lobsters because of global warming, that's probably what this reduction was. So actually, yeah, I mean, the illegal harvesting mentioned here is not the point. The point is this. And notice you got a couple of weapons here. The thing that's weird is that we don't normally think explicitly about assumptions in the real world, because we don't normally do that. That's why they're assumptions, because we don't really consciously think about them. But that's what makes this hard. But the advantage you've got here is you've got 2 separate routes that you can go. You can try to find what makes it necessary, or you can negate answer choices and see if it kills things. So let's look at the other choices. The average catch of a boat of the bad guys has increased steadily. The problem with this is that it doesn't matter, because we're not talking about individual boats. Like, all that matters is the aggregate catch. So individual boats doesn't make any difference. Aggregate stats here are all that matters. So there we go. And we also don't care about this either, has increased. I mean, we don't, that's not a thing. I mean, for the argument to work, we do need to assume that pirates are catching things, but not that they are catching more and more and more things every year. That's not a thing. This is, we don't need this to be true. I mean, the outlaw fishing boats If you make that false, you get the outlaw fishing boats do harvest more lobsters. But even if that's a thing, this argument can still proceed. I mean, like, if this is false, then that just means that the number caught by the outlaw boats is more than the other boats. But these statistics could still work. I mean, in that case, this decrease would be a gigantically huge decrease, but it's still doable. I mean, let's say that these guys harvested 9,000 tons of lobsters, and the legal boats that year only harvested 1,000 tons of lobsters. I mean, whoa, same problem, but it's not going to destroy this argument. This choice, the annual legal lobster harvest, same kind of problem that you've got in choice C. These answer choices are very closely related to each other. These answer choices are both saying that you have to have these answer choices are both about the pirates' harvest being more than the legal harvest. The relative amounts don't make any difference. The point is just that there is a decrease of 9,000 lobsters. It doesn't matter if it, or 9,000 tons of lobsters. It doesn't matter if it went from 9,001 tons to 1 ton, or like from 1,000,000 tons to 991,000 tons. It doesn't make any difference. So, like, the relative amounts don't matter. All that matters is the reduction in the legal catch. And then this last one, not only is this not necessary, but it's almost certainly false. Because it does say that the amount of legal lobster fishing has been the same. So it is all but impossible for this to be true. Because if this were true, then that would probably not be happening. So not only is this not necessary, but it probably can't even be a thing. So that leaves it with A. So any questions about that, feel free to put them in the box. We've been talking about this problem for a good long time. So let's see. Should we, the total population is not less than, I mean, MKD, that does have to be true, but that's like they're not going to go for assumptions that are like mathematical necessities here, because that's too easy, I guess, is the way to say it. I mean, because, yeah, you do have to have a population that is at least that big, because otherwise this decrease couldn't even be a thing. Like, if your pre-1992 levels were only 8,000 tons, then this would actually be impossible. So, isn't B the trick choice? Not really. I mean, if you... not really. I mean, there are two reasons why B is wrong that are very clear if you are thinking the right way here. I mean, it should be quite clear that catches per boat are not relevant, because we're only talking about the total. And it should also be clear that we don't need this to be an increase. So, if that seems like a trick, it probably just means it probably just means you didn't do this. Like, you didn't shave these down to something that a 10-year-old will understand. Because if you did, then it'll become clear why those things are not things. Okay, this question here, pre-think, kind of interesting word. I don't think pre-think is actually an English word, but let's just say that it is. Okay, so pre-think, like, in other words, should you try to predict, right? Is that what you mean? I think it's what you mean here. So let me replace that with predict. So that's my understanding of what this question is. If that's not what the question is, then feel free to pipe up. It depends. It depends on you. And let me explain what I mean by this. It depends on how you think. And because, okay, the point here is that there are multiple possible assumptions. So your prediction, even if it's actually an assumption, might not be the one that actually shows up in the choices. So that's the point here. I mean, so the question is, how will that affect you? Because, like, in other words, let's say in this problem, like, all of these are assumptions here. Every single one of these are all legitimate assumptions. So if you predict I won't run out of gas, that is a correct assumption, but they might give you that one instead. And so the answer to this question depends on how you think about that. Like, because if you will fixate on your prediction to the point where you won't be able to think about other options anymore, then don't predict. If not, if you will still be open to other possibilities, despite having formulated a prediction, then go ahead and predict because there's no downside. So, I mean, what I mean is this. Like, I'm kind of in the first group here. Like, you know, funny story, I got back from the airport with my wife once, like, last year, and I spent, like, half an hour looking for my car in the parking lot, and we actually had her car there, and I walked past it, like, 4 times. So, because what was happening was I was looking for my car, and I just, like, totally was not even thinking about her car being a thing, even when I walked right past it. So, for me, in these choices, it'd be a bad idea to make a prediction, because then I would be looking for my prediction, and I wouldn't, if I saw the other thing, I just wouldn't recognize it, you know? Like, if I predicted I won't run out of gas, I wouldn't notice the traffic light. I'd be like, not what I was thinking. So if you're like that, don't make a prediction because it'll close your mind off to other things, and very often the assumptions they pick will be another thing. So, but if not, if you are the kind of person who could be looking for your car and still instantly notice, oh, hey, that's my wife's car, then fine. And I mean, only you know which one of those two you are. I mean, it's just think about any situation that would help you figure that out. Like, imagine that you were doing a scavenger hunt and you were looking for one thing. Would you still see one of the other things? If so, then fine. Or if you're doing a word search, you know, one of those grids of letters where you have to circle the words. Like, do you still see other words while you're looking for a word? Those vary from person to person, so it really depends on the nature of you as a problem solver. Okay, let's take a look at another question. We have at least 2 before. I know a very long-winded answer, but that's the best answer I can give you. Okay, so let's take a look at take a look at this one. All right, so remember where you find the answer choices. And we'll probably continue this theme into the next study hall because we got a lot more than 2 assumption problems in this set. So go for it. Here's a timer. Have fun. All right. Remember to pick something. There are a few of you who have not picked something. So even if you have to make a wild guess, this would be the time to do that. So there's a Pallavi Sethi, hasn't picked an answer yet. Mariella, Jamila, number 4. go ahead and pick something if that's you. Okay. We're gonna move on here. We're still waiting on Pallavi, Sethi, and Mariella, but you gotta pick a guess. You just gotta do it. So here are your class statistics. So not a total majority for anything here, but at least a consensus for E here. But let's go ahead and talk about it. If there's any Canadians in here, there's a place actually that used to be named for this guy, but isn't named for this guy anymore. So if you're Canadian, you will probably have heard of this place. If you're not Canadian, you won't probably have heard of it. But it's the place. There used to be a place called Frobisher Bay, which used to be in the Northwest Territories, and now it's called Iqaluit, and now it's in Nunavut. So if you're Canadian, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is what it is now. Anyway, it's not a great place. It's really cold, and there's no trees and stuff like that. But that's where this Frobisher guy went. He went to where Iqaluit is now. So, okay, he went up there, way up there in no tree land, and he got some dirt and submitted it for gold testing. You know, like, is there gold in this dirt? And whoa, they reported that there was a lot of gold in the dirt. So again, imaginary 10-year-old in front of me, I'm explaining this to them. So explain to an imaginary 10-year-old. That's the single most important thing you can do here, by the way. Like, if you don't get these in your head to a point where you can imagine explaining them to a 10-year-old, then that means you haven't really achieved the kind of understanding that you have to achieve. So, okay. I can't really do a Canadian accent. Well, explain what this is all about. Yeah. Right. So he went up there to Canada, right? And he went up to Canada, and he found out what it was all about. Frobisher submitted some dirt samples, submitted some dirt samples to be tested for gold. And like, whoa, they found gold. They found gold in the tests. Okay. So, because there was, I mean, Elizabeth I was like, whoa, hey, tons of gold, so let's go get it. So the Queen sent miners there to get the gold. She was a gold digger. Yeah, exactly. And they didn't find anything, so they came up empty. And when we test the dirt today, testing methods show almost no gold. So the tests back when must have been wrong. Like, what tests are we concluding about here? For the test that we did today, modern analysis, or which test are we talking about here in this concluding statement? Talking about the test they did when, back in old methods, back when Frobisher was a thing, right? So the methods that they used way back then to test Frobisher's samples must have been faulty or bad methods. Okay, the 16th century test, yeah, so basically we're concluding that they must have not known how to really test for gold, you know, because they, right. Okay. Any ideas for an objection to this? Let's take that away for a second. I mean, how could we, right? Because maybe they had something like lick the dirt and see if it tastes like gold. Sure. I mean, it was the 16th century after all. I mean, some people back then didn't even know that blood circulated yet. So, I mean, they might have, and they didn't even know what chemical elements were until like the 19th century. So they probably had some pretty crappy methods of testing back then, sure. But how could you object to this argument? You may have any, like, I mean, let's say that someone was talking to you about this. Maybe the samples are messed up. Tell me some more about that, Nikhil, number 2. Like, how could you? I mean, because if you're thinking about this like you're actually talking to someone about it, you're going to be more likely to come up with this kind of stuff. Because remember that, I mean, who was this Frobisher guy? I mean, he was an explorer who, basically worked for Queen Elizabeth. And I mean, you know how it was with explorers, right? I mean, they had to go beg the Queen for money to go explore. So if you think about that situation, you'll be more able to come up with stuff like this. Because if this guy was able to convince Elizabeth that there was gold on this island, then he would get all the money and all the people and all the boats to go back there and hang out. And, I don't know why you want to go back to Iqaluit, but, so he would definitely get all the stuff from the Queen, right? So if you're thinking about that, you might think, maybe the guy is a hustler, because if he randomly slipped some gold into those samples, then they're going to think it had all the gold, right? So what if the samples themselves were the problem? I mean, or another way to think about this is to simplify the argument. I mean, try to do this if you can. Let's see if we can do this in 2 or 3 sentences. Because if you can do that without losing the essence of it, you're going to be better off here. So in 2 or 3 sentences, the deal is that 16th century tests showed gold is there for soil from this part of Canada. However, today our tests show gold is not there. Therefore, what we're saying, the problem is the tests themselves from back then. Okay, I mean, that's basically this argument in a nutshell. So if you think about this, then it becomes more, at least when you do this, it becomes more obvious how to object to it. Because, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the rest of the evidence. The rest of the evidence pretty clearly shows us, and the test back then said yes, and the test today said no. But the idea is we just kind of made up the fact that this is the problem. What if the problem was something else? What if the problem wasn't the test as much as it was, the samples? What if it was? What if the samples and not the test were the issue instead? So this is, I mean, there could have been a lot of things wrong with the samples. What if they were contaminated? What if they stored them? Because remember, this Frobisher guy had to, come all the way back from northern Canada to England with these things. So what if they sat next to gold on the boat and got contaminated? Or what if he put gold in there on purpose? Or whatever it was, right? But there's a lot of reasons this could have happened. So if you do that, then you realize that this is an objection. So we have to assume that this is not a thing. So we have to assume that the samples themselves were not the issue. So that's one of the things. We have to assume a much more general class of things, but that's one of them. I mean, we also have to assume, for example, that, you know, all kinds of other things like that. I mean, we also have to assume, for instance, we also have to assume, for instance, that the samples weren't accidentally contaminated with gold while sitting on the ship or something. So the person testing may have had no knowledge of how to conduct the test. That's true, but that would be I mean, that's not an objection to this, because that would just be a way in which the methods would be inaccurate. I mean, the methods might be inaccurate because the methods were inaccurate, or they may have been accurate because the person running the test was an idiot. But those are not really that different. Okay, you also have to assume that today's samples and today's tests are accurate. That is true. This is actually very true, what Manju is saying. And notice that if you were looking for that, then it becomes this issue that we were talking about again here. Where was it? This. So if you were looking for what Manju is looking for and you would not notice choice E here, then it would be very dangerous to make a prediction like that. But if you would still notice choice E, then that's not a bad way to think. Right. If we talk in terms of negating this, see, here's the thing. I mean, this negation method is really your friend. Because if you negate this, I mean, the word obvious is a very dangerous word to use, but if you negate the right answer, it should become pretty obvious that the argument is destroyed. So, like, if you negate choice E, you get, I mean, choice E says gold was not added to the samples. So if you negate that, you get it was. Gold was added by Frobisher himself before the tests were run on it. I mean, before the tests were run on the samples. So, then the samples. If this is true, then it should be very clear that this argument is totally dead. Because if he tampered with the samples, then of course the methods were not the problem. The problem was that we were looking at samples that were totally not the right samples anymore. So, do this method. If there's any issues with these problems, try the negations, because it will definitely make your life a lot easier. Like the negations, the negation is usually much easier to recognize. So, like here, totally. I mean, the reason why this is true is because what you're doing when you negate the argument is a much more normal thought process. Because, like, finding assumptions explicitly is not normal. It's not something that we usually do. But saying, no, you're wrong is a very normal thought process. We do that all the time, every day. So, and when you negate the answer choices, that becomes what you're trying to do. You're trying to prove that the argument is, like, wrong-headed. And, of course, we do that every day with people that we talk to. So it becomes a much more natural type of thought process. So, okay, as far as the other answer choices go, B, there's no distinctions between different parts of the island anywhere in the argument, so, you know, it's all the same. C, the methods that we would definitely generally used. I mean, because we don't care, right? The only methods that we care about were the ones that they used. So the only thing that matters is the methods that they used in this one case for these particular samples. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like if I say, I don't know, like you estimated your body fat percent using a set of calipers, and you got results that were crazy, then, you know, if I say most people estimate body fat by submerging themselves in water instead of with calipers, it doesn't matter, right? Because we're just talking about your use of calipers. So make analogies like that if you have to, but it doesn't matter whether the methods they used were crazy and exotic and weird, because that's not the comparison. It's not the methods versus the mainstream methods back then. It's the method they used, whatever the heck it was, versus modern results. So hopefully that helps there. Frobisher, other Canadian island, doesn't matter, other islands, like the whole passage is just about the stuff they found on this one place. I don't even know how to pronounce that. But the whole argument is just about this place. And then finally, E, correct answer. Oh, and I guess we forgot to talk about A. A is, it's not a thing. I mean, in fact, not only is this not a thing, but it would actually go the other way. Because if this were true, then it would actually be more likely that the tests were right and not inaccurate. Like, there's a lot more gold back then. So this would, it doesn't support the conclusion. It actually beats the conclusion, but that it defeats it. But that's not what we want. I mean, if you negate these things, they're supposed to defeat it. This defeats it the way it's written right now. I mean, this actually goes against the argument. So, because this would lead us to think that the tests were perfectly correct. Anything that goes the wrong way is bad here. So again, if you don't realize that, it's because you're thinking of these as academic things and not as real-world type of arguments. I mean, in the real world, you would definitely know that something that defeated your point was not an assumption. But just make sure you import the same kind of thought process here. Okay, to the people asking about difficulty levels, the answer is doesn't matter. You don't care, so don't think about it. That's the only worthwhile answer to that question ever. So there's a problem in front of you, solve it. That's pretty much what we're doing. Any thoughts of things like that will just distract you from solving the problem, and that is not a good thing. Okay, we are way over time here, so we're going to go ahead and quit. I will tell you for the next session we'll do some more of these things because we've got some more of them lined up. So these assumption type problems. And yeah, I wanted to jazz flute duet with Ron Burgundy. I have no idea what that means, but apparently there's a joke that I'm not privy to here. All right, you're welcome, and Anchorman, I don't know if this is some TV reference. I don't get it. Okay, so the next study hall is going to be more of these assumption things, but I can take that. The overlapping sets thing, I can consider it. It's one of the things that we cover as a topic in our 9-session course, which makes me a little bit more loath to cover it, but I'll think about it. Go ahead and submit it on the actual form. Like, otherwise I'll just forget by 10 minutes from now. So if you have submissions, please submit them on the actual web page. So, all right, you guys, you're welcome. So, yeah, Amit, you shouldn't really take notes unless you absolutely have to take notes, which means you are totally confused and are trying to get a foothold. If you already get it in your head, there's no reason to take notes. Okay. Yeah, Nick Hill number 2, just submit it, please. Submit it with the form that's on the website. Okay, I'm going to kill the recording at this point. Thank you. And yeah, we'll see you in a couple weeks here.